What do you remember best about it?
That's been a long time ago, of course. Father died in 1926. I was a senior in high school and was due to graduate in January 1927, so it was a very traumatic experience at that age. However, he had been ill for a long time, and Father was a great worker. He was a hard worker. He was 68 at the time of his death, but he had a wonderful opportunity during his lifetime to be associated with great people. He was essentially a builder. He was a carpenter and a mechanic and a bricklayer and a stonemason, and was raised under pioneer influences and times in St. George after they came from England when he was only 5 years of age. And it was interesting to note that in the journey that took place coming across from New York down to St. Louis and then across the plains, he said, I was only 5, but I can well remember that I rode very little. I walked most of the way into the Salt Lake Valley. And subsequently they were sent down into St. George to colonize his father and family. And there it was that he grew up to young manhood. And then after his mother died, why, there was some difficulty with the stepmother, and that resulted eventually in his leaving home at about 17 and a half, and going down into the Arizona territory to work. And that's, of course, where he met my mother, who was a worker for the, and cooking for the railroad that was building through that country. And it's interesting to note that his experiences had prepared him well to be a pioneer in that area. I remember Father as not a large individual. He was only about 5'8", but a powerful build. I can recall very well, for instance, he had a job delivering for a big drug company in San Diego. And at that time, I can remember going around with him as just a small boy, and see him lift barrels full of stuff off that low bed truck, that horse and wagon drawn dray, they called them in those days. And he would lift barrels that would weigh 250 pounds without any great difficulty whatsoever.
He was only 5'8".
Yeah, 5'8".
The image of the leverage necessary.
That's right. And he became very ill at that time. He'd had some bowel trouble, and they had done a resection of the bowel, but it wasn't as successful as it might be. So when they took him back into the hospital to do some further work on it, why, he never returned. But interestingly enough, when he went to the hospital, he turned to me, and Mother were there, and Mother and I, and he turned to me and said, "I'll never come back." And then shortly after that, why, I was at home. I had come home from school, and it was made known in a very spiritual way. His father had died. For me.
I remember you telling us about your dad as a fiddle player.
Oh, he was a great musician. Dad could play any instrument he ever picked up. He was a banjo. Essentially, he was a banjo player, and he played a six-string banjo, which is very unusual.
Was he self-taught?
And self-taught. He also could play the fiddle. And when he was a young man in the Arizona area, he would very often come home from, at the time he was running a lime kiln, burning lime for a building. and the older boys were working with him, and he would come home from there, and he would eat a little dinner and jump on his horse and ride 50 or 60 miles to play all night for a dance.
Yeah.
And he played the banjo and the fiddle and the mouth organ, and that was the band for the dance. And then he would also call sometimes, at the same time he would play and call the square dance figures.
How did his wife care for that that journey that he would take, or that involvement?
It was difficult, but any time you could make a buck in those days, you took it. And with a family of at that time then of actually at that time there was 15 at home, children, and older brothers and sisters, of course, and father would, mother, of course, had a small farm and a house in Thatcher, Arizona. They had gone, she and her sister and her husband, Woods, had gone from Thatcher to drive a buckboard up to the temple at St. George. And believe me, that was a trip in those days. And they drove it there, the four of them, up and stayed in the St. George area for a while because he had family yet there. And then had driven back, but he had some marvelous things. Now, when they first went down into the Arizona territory to settle there, just after their marriage, when they came back from St. George, Geronimo was still active in that area. And just ahead of them, less than a day, he had killed several settlers that were coming down into that area. And they didn't know about it at the time, but they went over the same road and down into the Thatcher and Solomonville area and southeastern Arizona, where they, of course, settled. They were right on the Gila River, and Father had built a little house, lean-to and willow roof and sod roof, and that's where Mother had her first child. And he was gone out to work, and Mother was in bed, and the river rose and came up about 6 or 8 inches on the mud floor of the cabin. And she, of course, got real excited there in bed by herself with a new baby. And finally, Father came home, and she was kind of yelling at that time because a couple of big old red racers were climbing up the wall and up into the thatch roof, and she didn't like that too well. And he said, "Well, no, Mandy, don't worry about it. That's a hard pan floor, and the water will maybe come up a couple more inches, but your bed won't sink."
She didn't care for Indians too much.
Not too well, but then, interestingly enough, they followed the advice of Brigham Young when he settled into the Salt Lake area. He said it's a lot easier to feed them than fight them. And there was hardly in those days a day would go by that they would have the indigent Indian people come by and beg something to eat. Mother always fed them. They always had. I can remember as a child, as an example, with a big family, I can remember Mother baking 16 loaves of bread at a time. And that probably was about every 4 or 5 days. And we would have, even at that time, in San Diego, then we subsequently moved to San Diego. Father had been disappointed in a building project. He'd built a big siphon underneath the dry river there to carry the water into the area, and the government, the county rather, was supposed to cover it with teams of horses and cover it with soil and wet it down all the time so it wouldn't crack. Well, they didn't do it. And so it cracked, and Dad had to stand all of that expense, and it wiped him out financially. It cost him right around $100,000 eventually, and that's quite a bit of money in those days.
This would have been probably what?
That would have been about. I was born there in 1908, and so that would have been. I was about 5, I think, when we came to San Diego. So that would have been 13. 12 or 13, we moved to San Diego. And settled in the southeastern portion of town, which was called at that time Cholla Heights, because it was close to the Mexican border.
Oh, okay.
And he came in there, incidentally, most interesting, with all those children, without a dime in his pocket, literally.
Mm-hmm.
He'd gone over first, and mother followed, and with the rest of the family. And Dad walked, he saw this house for rent. And he went to the owner and said, "I'd like to rent your house." And he said, "Oh, that's fine." Quite a big place, quite a good sized place. And Dad said, "But I don't have any money." And he talked to him for a little while and said, "But I'm a worker, and I've got a good trade, and I'm a builder, and I'll pay you as soon as I get settled." And the man looked at him and sized him up and down and said, "You can have it." So he rented him the house, and Dad then went down to the market and told the same story to the owner of the market, and he sized him up and said, "I'll give you 1 month free food." Not free, but I'll charge it. And they did, and so that's the way they became settled in San Diego. And it wasn't long, just a few days, until he was working as a bricklayer, buildings there, which he continued to do almost all of his life, building. He was up in the coastal area around La Jolla and built a lot of the commercial buildings up in that way. And he was a good provider. I can remember, interestingly enough, about the time he was working there when I was just a young fellow. Dad would come home at the end of the week and have his pay in his hand. And I can just still see that just as clearly as anything in the world. He would walk over to Mother and drop these $20 gold pieces into her hand, 3 $20 gold pieces for the household expense.
For the week.
For the week.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was pretty good money in those days, way back then.
When you moved from Thatcher, then you were a young man. You were 11, 12.
No, I wasn't really that old. I was only around 5.
Oh, okay. And so your older brothers. Now your oldest brother was Dan. Okay.
Yeah.
And Dan would have been about 25.
Yes, and he was married then. He just remember about that time he was married.
Now you guys.
And my 2 older sisters were married.
And then
Blanche and
Dora.
And Dora.
Yeah.
No, Dora didn't get married till later. That was in San Diego.
Oh, okay.
Blanche and I'll remember the name.
But
anyway, they were older sisters. And then interesting.
Did they come too? They come to?
No, they didn't come.
Okay.
They stayed in Arizona.
All right.
Leah also came out, but then she was married in San Diego. Then she went back to the valley, and she divorced that first husband, and then was remarried and stayed in the valley until her death. Well, she died up in Phoenix. But anyway, my 2 older brothers, my 2 older brothers, Heber and Leif, drove Dad's great big team out with a big wagon, big work wagon, clear from the valley out to San Diego. Beautiful pair of work horses.
Oh, was that from Thatcher or from Mesa?
That was Thatcher.
Thatcher.
Yeah,
okay.
from Thatcher.
So
Thatcher, clear to San Diego, and that's several hundred miles.
Got to be close to 500.
And they brought a friend with them, a close friend also, to kind of help out. Wasn't a cousin really, but he was like a cousin. And they ran out of food.
Oh.
And they got out there
on the road.
Yeah, on the road. And they got out there on the desert and towards Yuma and out in there, and they were hungry, and they would hunt a little bit and catch a rabbit now and then. But they were really down one day, and so they said, "Well, what are we yelling about? Let's go get us some food." And they went out and caught 2 or 3 big old rattlers and cut them up and barbecued them and said, "Best meat they ever ate." And rattlesnake meat is very white meat, very sweet.
Well, they came across the Yuma Dunes.
Yes, oh yeah.
Was that a corduroy road at the time?
Yeah, well, no, they didn't have much of anything there. They just had to kind of wind their way around there. Now, I went over the corduroy road.
What was your
way
mother?
Back, yeah. No.
On the trip out?
Yeah.
Okay, how did you get here?
Well, I came with Mother, and we came on the train.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we went up. Okay. They went up to. I can't recall now whether they went into the Phoenix area, but up that way, and the train came through, and they caught the train came out. And I've got some pictures of me and Mother about that age, about that time that happened.
Tell me about. Do you remember your grandfather at all?
No, I never knew on my father's side. No, I never knew him. He passed away. As a matter of fact, that was a very interesting story. My grandfather, William Button Kemp, was a very fine craftsman. He was a sailmaker. He was a weaver. We still have, I think, a little sample of weaving someplace. And whether I've lost it or not to somebody, I don't know, but I've got a picture of it. That they did when they were in England. The family were weavers, and he was a sailmaker, and he was a naval man. And interestingly enough, he worked on the St. George Temple for all the time that it was in building. And then they couldn't afford to put a roof on the St. George Temple. So he said, I'll make a roof out of sailcloth if you can find it, the cloth. And so they did. And he hand-stitched the entire temporary roof for the St. George Temple. And he put it on, installed it, and then they got him some tar, and of course they just plain old melted tar, and they began mopping that in gradually every day, and he worked so hard, it was during the summertime, to get that finished, that he got a heat stroke and that killed him at that time. But he was a very accomplished musician also. He led the choir, he fine singing voice. And he led the choir there in St. George for years when they lived there. He made a clock that still operates over in the what do they call it? It's like a big meeting house there.
Tabernacle?
Tabernacle,
yeah.
The St. George Tabernacle that still hangs there and it still runs.
In a clock?
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to go look at that. I never knew that.
I presume it is still there, years ago when we were in there. But they were very instrumental in the group that settled in St. George. And,
tell me about this. This is an uncle, I assume.
Yeah, that's Uncle Arthur. Did I write that on there? No, that's Walter. I'm sorry. That's Walter John Kemp.
Okay. Did you know him?
Yes, I knew him. Walter was.
Looks like a character.
Yes, he was, as a matter of fact, and his Uncle Arthur looked very much like him. But Walter was a sort of a footloose and fancy-free, and he went up to. He stayed in the St. George area for a long time, and also Uncle Jim stayed up there, and then he went up into the Salt Lake area and established a big farm down at what is now Sandy, right along the old main boulevard, 89. He was on both sides of the roads there for years, and when we went up there in 1925, drove a Model T touring car from San Diego. Marvin, my brother, and I, and Mother and Dad, drove a 1921 Model T Ford touring car. And we drove it clear to Salt Lake. 7 days traveling time, not counting 2 days we had to stay over in Mesquite, Nevada to replace a broken axle. And maybe you think that wasn't the experience. And no roads to mount anything.
But he has a cross pinned on his lapel.
Yeah.
Is that of any significance?
Not really.
Just decoration.
That's right. He was just that was him.
That's great.
That was typical of him, I'm saying. But now Uncle Jim had an interesting life also. In the early days, in there, as he got married and established this big farm, he first took that out, that land down in Sandy. Why, he drove freight wagons from Salt Lake to Los Angeles. A big old double wagon with about 8 span of mules, or 4 span of mules. That would be 8 mules, and 2 big high-wheeled wagons that would, hold up in the sand in the open country. And on the back of the 2 wagons, they would have a big water tank that they carried their water. And he would drive that in a round trip from there, and it took them generally about 2 to 3 weeks, and carry freight into Los Angeles, and they'd load up with manufactured goods out of Los Angeles and take them back to Salt Lake in a fair trade. And so he was a hardy old soul.
This is in the late 1800s.
Yes, late 1800s, before the turn of the century. Well, but,
Now your dad worked on the Salt Lake Temple.
He also did. That's right. He for a little while after he had sort of broken in and actually almost learned the stonemason's trade at St. George. Then when he left home, he went to Salt Lake, and
he was about 16.
Yeah, 16, 17, maybe, right in that area, and worked for quite a little while on the Salt Lake Temple as well while they were finishing up there. And then he decided that wasn't for him, so that's when he went down to...
During that time in Salt Lake, apparently he knew of, or personally knew, Porter Rockwell.
Oh, I'm sure. That was one of his heroes, Porter Rockwell was. And I think he had indeed met him. I'm not sure the timing.
Well, the timing would have been probably right for him.
But he really was a fan of Porter Rockwell, because he was the typical Western hero, so to speak.
Yeah.
He was a kind of a scallywag in many ways. He didn't pay too much attention, but he saved the prophet's life a time or two, and he could be depended on, and he was a great hand with the Indians.
Yeah.
He could just
deal with them
on their level, and he even spoke much of their language.
And your dad's association, or at least admiration of him, led to...
Oh yes, naming my brother Rockwell.
Rockwell, yeah, okay.
Just older than I.
Of course, I didn't. Your father was long gone before I was born, but I remember Grandma real well, because she lived with us on occasion, as I remember, didn't she?
Yes.
Or stayed with us.
On that tape that Stephen has.
Yeah.
Is one of the best pictures of Grandma Kemp.
Oh, okay. I was hoping, because the one we had in there only had a small.
Right.
Small
it was down at the Rockies,
good.
And it was we had built the little apartment about 15, and you and Steve were with us, and you had that little alligator that snapped his jaws that way like this.
Oh yeah.
And you were running around scaring Grandma.
Okay, I remember now. Well, she used to tell us marvelous stories.
Oh yeah.
When she lived with us, and the one that I remember probably most dramatically is the one that when she was a little girl, as a part of that group that was.
Oh yeah, she was 13.
Oh, she okay.
She was 13. And that was when her father, George H. Brimhall, not George H., I'm sorry, Noah. George H. was an uncle. Noah and his company, and he was one of the leaders of that. He never did get the proper credit on the articles on that. But at any rate, they were asked by Brigham Young to go down in to settle the Little Colorado River in Arizona. And which they did, but in the process they had to cross the Colorado, and in that, they came to the ferry that was across there, and he wouldn't.
That'd be Lee's Ferry.
Lee's Ferry,
okay.
And he wouldn't take the ferry out because it was freezing. It was ice, and there was ice on the river, chunks of ice coming. He was afraid it would hold his ferry and put him out of business. So he said, no way. And so they waited about 2 or 3 days. And they were running out of fodder for the cattle and the horses and one thing and another that they'd brought down. And so they got together and discussed it and said, well, we'll wait one more day and pray about it, and if don't, we'll build some rafts and we'll go back and pick up some timber and come down and build rafts and take ourselves across. Well, they watched all night, and by about 3 o'clock in the morning, the river began to freeze over.
Did they have a prayer circle?
Yes,
she told me about?
You bet.
Yeah.
The river began to freeze over, And by 4:30, they went out with poles and checked the ice. And they said, it looks good. And so they went back and got a little sand and put a little trail out over the ice. And they had an old cow that was a kind of the leader of the stock. They'd follow her, and they led her across, and the stock followed. And then they said, okay, we're going to go. And so all the children took everything they could out of the wagons and turned the tables upside down and scooted one another across the ice, across the river. Got on the other side. I think it was 11 wagons, if I'm not mistaken, are in that number. And as the last wagon, front wheels came up on the bank on the far side, the very last wagon, the back wheels broke through the ice. In 5 minutes, there was no ice in sight.
Isn't that amazing?
Now, talk about the miracle.
She was actually riding in a covered wagon.
Yeah, exactly.
To colonize East Arizona. Had that spiritual experience.
And they went down and established that colony on the Little Colorado. It was very difficult because every time they put a dam in, it would flood and knock the dam out. And then they set up a shared program. Everybody was equal. They shared everything, you know. United Order, actually. And it was very successful for a long time. And they finally did establish themselves there quite well. But then they began to spread out. And Father Brimhall, Grandfather Brimhall, and then it was when he came down into the Phoenix area. And,
yeah, right. and of course, a lot of the Brimhalls, that
huge
huge family, came out of the Phoenix Mesa area.
Exactly, Phoenix Mesa area in there. And Grandfather was a very interesting thing. The tales about him, of course, are remarkable. Because he was born at a time.
On the raft.
He was born he was born way up in the Monongahela River, where his father operated a sawmill up there and made shingles and timber, and so they wanted to get out of there. It was a remote and very frigid area, and so he said, "Okay, we'll build an ark." And so he built out of his own timber, and they built this big barge, if you want to call it that, and then on the deck he built 3 little huts out of bundles of shingles to live in. And so there's several boys. There must have had 6 or 7 boys, and they all embarked on the yacht. And then Grandfather had just been born shortly, and they named him Noah because it was born aboard the ark.
That's great. I remember Grandma telling us a story about your father, Grandpa, kicking a bear.
Oh,
do you remember that story?
Yeah, that was a true story. He was when he was just a young man.
Was he married?
No. That was before he was married. Yeah, he was out looking for the cattle, some cattle, and he was supposed to have gone to get them earlier, and he was almost dark, or just about dusk and dark, and he finally spotted this black spot, and he thought, well, that's our black cow. I'll go down and get him, get her. And so he walks down around this little swale in the sort of a little meadow, and by a big rock there, and he went over, and he thought it was a cow laying down there. So he went over and kicked her, and it turned out to be a big old black bear.
You know which one was more scared, huh?
Yeah, the bear went one way. He said, the bear went one way, and I went the other.
That's great.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, when you were a young man, you were the youngest of 16.
That's right.
And you must have been pretty spoiled.
Yes, as a matter of fact, my 3 older sisters that were home literally raised me. That's Opal and Ruth particularly, and Leah when she was home for a while there, and even Dora had a share in that, but Dora married early on. She married a man by the name of Oliver Fletcher, who was...
She was about 18, wasn't she?
Yes, right. She was very young. Oliver was a great guy. Never was joined the church or anything like that. But I can remember when I was just a kid, he would never come to our house as Marvin Rock and I were just kids, and he would never come to our house except he some kind of a toy, a baseball bat or a ball or a glove or something or other, and then he'd get out and play with us. And he was a great mechanic. He in the early automobiles, early on, he was also a motorcycle rider in those early days, and he got himself busted up
Or
several
did he?
times.
Is he the one that got all your brothers into motorcycle racing?
Yeah.
And then when he got busted up, did they give it up or something?
Yeah, that I did too. Because I rode for quite a long time.
Is that he the one that went through the windshield? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right.
Broke his leg in about 7 places or
mhm.
something?
But he turned out to be one of the finest mechanics in the whole San Diego area. As a matter of fact, he worked over on North Island, and these officers in the Air Corps would wangle a way to get into the Navy or the base down there just to bring their car down to have him tune up. He was a carburetor specialist, and he would set them so they get the best mileage and best performance, you know, and rebuild them and all that type of thing.
Well, this little Lord Fauntleroy picture here, looks like you're kind of ticked off at somebody.
I probably was to get myself dressed up like that.
Gussied up and so on.
That's about the last time. I was about, what, I'm trying to remember.
It says about 1915.
1915, yeah. So you see that was...
About 7 years old.
I wouldn't be too old there. I hadn't reached 8 yet.
Did, this was in San Diego. Oh yeah, you'd been in San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I remember you telling me some stories about some of your work in San Diego, and somebody had mentioned something about a flood and something that your family did.
Oh gosh, that residence that we were in San Diego, the first one we had, Dad bought that house, by the way, after renting it for a while, and it was very, very comfortable and big enough for the family. But we were right near the Bay Area. That came out of the San Diego Bay and went down towards Chula Vista and down through there, see, and then you had to take the Strand and come clear back to go over to Coronado if you wanted to there, almost into Mexico. Yeah. And that area was flood prone, and so in around 1915, not too far from there, why I can recall going down there with the kids and the folks and one thing and another, and it washed about 8 or 10 homes that were on that area, washed them right out into the bay. And the railroad track ran across there also, in that shortcutted in that area, and it washed everything out from under the railroad tracks, and the only thing that was holding them up, the rails were fastened to the ties, see? And here was a big stretch, and so I remember some of the older kids walking out on that thing, right over this rushing river coming down through there. And then shortly after that, then we moved from there up to the northeast part of town, which was the east part of town, just over the valley, the big valley that comes down.
Mission Valley.
Mission Valley, yeah.
Now somebody had mentioned that some of your brothers had done some rescue work or something during that flood.
The older boys, as a matter of fact, were involved. See, in 1918, Omer and Carol and Heber were all in the service, so they were well along in years, you know, and we had a lot of service people in our home with 3 girls available. And interesting story there, Opal, being the younger of those, and we lived right across the street from a huge Chinese truck farm that was owned by some very fine Chinese people. And we used to buy vegetables and everything for literally nothing over there because we just walked across the street, you know. But anyway, the son of the owner fell in love with my sister Opal. And I'm telling you, he besieged her with presents and flowers and invitations and one thing and another.
Did you get a lot of vegetables?
Oh, I'm sure. But it was quite comical in the fact, well, of course, she didn't want to have anything to do with it. But about that time, then, her husband, Bill Millar, came into the picture.
Now, he was in the Navy.
He was in the Navy there in San Diego.
Yeah.
And that's where they met. Art Klinger, Ruth's husband, was in the Navy there. He was an officer, a lieutenant, a first lieutenant in the service. And that's how they met then at that time. And then Heber then was married about that time. Just before, yeah, he was I can't remember whether it was Martin just before he went into service or just after he got out, but anyway, early times there. So we had them all, and they all went through, well, we all did in the family, went through that 1918 scare for flu.
Yeah.
Oh boy, it killed a lot of people.
Killed a lot of people. Now your family didn't lose anybody.
No, but they were everybody was sick in the family but Dad. And he took care of all of it. Everybody. Well, I didn't have it very well, but I can remember helping him go around and hold dishes for him and one thing and another, like, cause I wasn't affected by it a great deal. Yeah. And that was 1918, you see, so I would have been 10.
10 years old. Now your brothers, of course, you know, I remember them probably better than your sisters.
Oh yes, I'm sure, because they were all married and we didn't get to see them. But now Rock and Marv.
But I remember Dan and Eve and Leif, and those folks. And I remember, my impression as a youngster was that your brothers were all doing interesting things.
Yes, they were, as a matter of fact. Now, as an example, let's take Leif, for example. He worked for the San Diego Electric and Power Company there, gas and electric. And he drove the big equipment truck, and they'd go out and repair lines, you know, that type of thing. He was a supervisor, I guess you'd call it. He also drove the truck. But he was a very, very accomplished mechanic with everything. He was just a natural mechanic and could repair or do anything, as Oliver was, for instance. But he married out of the church, and although she never was antagonistic at all, she never was helpful either. Neither was he. Well, and so, but he was a great guy, a great jokester, just loved a good time. He just, and then the Heber, that was Leif.
Now Leif stands for?
Lafayette.
Yeah. Did he take a lot of kidding about that name? Or did most people accept him as Leif by then?
Yeah, Leif by then, that's right. Now Lafayette comes, interestingly enough, from a family name, family situation, because my grandfather, Noah, married a nurse whose father, Gertrude, was a personal physician for Lafayette.
And so that's where the name.
And that's how the name got down.
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting.
That's really interesting.
Well, how about your middle name and my middle name?
That and I just don't know for sure, but I think that the family was through mother somehow that name came.
Now that's your mother's lineage comes through.
That's the Brimhall.
Brimhall and then Jones, which was Welsh.
Welsh.
Yeah, okay.
And it could have come someplace there. I'm not really sure, but I suspect so.
I remember Carol probably because he was the younger brothers. I remember more, and then of course Opal and Omer and Opal. I remember the brothers fairly well.
Yeah. And Carol was all his life was a shoemaker, and he worked on North Island there in the station. I used to go over and work with him a lot over there. As a matter of fact, when he had a shoe store down on Wilcox, Arizona, across the Grand Mountain.
Sure.
And I went down there and worked for him all summer. We took off this month. And I was a big old husky kid, you know. I had a lot of people come into the store and say, "Carol, what do you think of this?" And they would thought that they were seeing Carol. And
I see.
And I stayed all summer. We used to laugh about it. We'd go home for lunch and we'd laugh about it. But anyway, then he came back after that. He came back and got that franchise at North Island and had a very success. He sold shoes and repaired shoes for the servicemen. And that's where I find my first airplane flight came. One of the pilots there stowed me aboard a PBY.
Oh, is that right?
And I flew in one of those big old
flying boats.
Yeah. They weren't supposed to do that, but I bugged them so much that as pilots I got acquainted with them. And then, of course, at that time, a little after that, then Art Klinger began working there. He was a very